Frost Hollow, Colorado Territory. Late October, 1876. The church bell swung in the October wind, its iron tongue striking brass in a rhythm Zelda Remy would never hear. She knelt in the rutted dirt road below the whitewashed steps, her traveling dress heavy with dust from 3 days on the narrow-gauge railway that climbed into these unforgiving mountains. The hem had torn on a baggage hook at the depot, and now it dragged in the mud collecting stones and grit. In her lap, she clutched a bouquet of roses she'd purchased with her last dollar in Denver, wilted now, their petals brown and curling at the edges like dying prayers. Around her, men laughed. Not the embarrassed chuckle of decent folk witnessing an awkward moment, but the cruel guttural sound of predators who'd cornered prey. Ranch hands and dusty chaps leaned against the church railing, elbowing each other and pointing. A teamster with a tobacco-stained beard slapped his thigh so hard his hat nearly fell off. The storekeeper who'd arranged the match, a balding, narrow-shouldered man named Gideon Pratt, stood at the top of the steps beside his cousin Thomas, the intended groom. Thomas's face had gone pale as milk, his mouth twisted like he'd bitten into meat gone bad. Deaf as a post, Gideon announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying across the churchyard with the satisfaction of a man proving himself right. Didn't mention that little detail in her letters, did she? Just wrote all nice and proper. Probably copying from some book, I reckon. My cousin here isn't about to shackle himself to damaged goods. No, sir. Zelda couldn't hear the words, but she'd learned to read rejection in 100 subtle ways. The curl of a lip, the turn of a shoulder, the way eyes slid past her, as though she were a ghost. She'd felt it in orphanages where matrons spoke over her head to each other. She'd felt it in the parlors of distant relatives who took her in only long enough to arrange her transfer elsewhere. She'd felt it in the faces of employers who saw her deafness as a moral failing, a divine punishment, or simply an inconvenience they couldn't afford. The roses trembled in her gloved hands. She'd been foolish to hope that distance and a man's desperation might overcome what so many others had found insurmountable. Foolish to believe the letters exchanged over 6 months meant anything when confronted with the reality of her silence. A clod of dirt struck her shoulder, exploding into powder. She flinched, turning to see the teamster winding up to throw another. Laughter swelled around her like a tide. Someone shouted something. She caught the shapes of the words on his lips, crude and dismissive. A woman in the crowd pulled her shawl tighter and looked away, unwilling to intervene. Zelda clutched the roses harder, feeling thorns bite through her glove, into her palm, the sharp pain grounding her, keeping her from collapsing entirely. Then the laughter stopped. The crowd's attention shifted like a flock of starlings changing direction. Heads turned toward the western edge of town, where the freight road descended from the timber line. Zelda followed their gazes and saw a figure moving against the low autumn sun, a silhouette haloed in amber and gold. He walked with an unhurried stride, neither fast nor slow, his shadow stretching long across the packed earth like a dark promise. As he drew closer, details emerged from the glare: buckskin shirt and leggings decorated with blue and white beadwork in geometric patterns that caught the light dark hair braided and wrapped with strips of red cloth, a knife in a beaded sheath at his belt. His skin was bronze, his features angular and strong cheekbones, sharp enough to cut glass eyes dark as creek stones. He was Lakota, unmistakably so, and the men on the church steps stiffened like dogs catching a strange scent. Chaska Redhawk had come to Frost Hollow to trade as he did each autumn before the high passes filled with snow, and the town became an island in a frozen sea. He carried bundles of winter pelts and pouches of medicinal roots, yarrow for fevers, willow bark for pain, strapped to a sturdy dun mare he'd tethered at the livery. He'd heard the commotion from 2 streets over and had seen enough cruelty in his 28 years to recognize the particular sound a mob makes when it smells weakness. Now, as he stepped into the churchyard, his gaze swept over the assembled men with cool dismissal before settling on the woman kneeling in the road. He took in the scene in an instant. The torn dress, the wilted flowers, the dirt on her shoulder, the way she held herself spine straight despite everything refusing to collapse, even as the world collapsed around her. He moved between her and the teamster, his body angled protectively, one hand resting on the leather-wrapped hilt of his knife. His other hand rose fingers moving in the fluid gestures of Plains Indian Sign Language, a language of survival and trade, understood across tribal boundaries, and in some places by whites who'd spent time on the frontier. Chaska's signs were deliberate and easily readable enough. Stop. Then slowly he signed and spoke aloud, so even those who couldn't read his hands would understand his intent. She is better than all of you. The mockery died in throats. Silence fell over the churchyard, broken only by the distant creak of wagon wheels somewhere in town, and the rustle of dry grass against the cemetery fence. The teamster's hand hovered near his belt, where a rusted Navy revolver jutted from a cracked leather holster. His fingers twitched. Tension coiled in the air like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Deputy Wade Mullen emerged from the shadow of the church, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted everyone to see him coming. He was thick-bodied and in his 40s, with a drooping mustache stained yellow from tobacco, and eyes that calculated every interaction in terms of profit or loss. His badge pinned crooked on his vest caught the afternoon light. In the crook of his arm, he cradled a double-barreled shotgun, its barrels worn smooth from years of use. "No fights on church grounds," Mullen announced, his tone flat and bureaucratic. "Red Hawk, you keep your business to the trading post and the livery. This here's a private matter between the Pratt family and their guest." Chaska didn't move. His gaze held Mullen's for a long-waited beat, a silent challenge that made the deputy's jaw tighten and his knuckles go white on the shotgun's stock. Behind Chaska, Zelda pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling from exhaustion and hunger. She'd eaten almost nothing on the 3-day journey, rationing the bread and cheese she'd brought until both were gone. Now her stomach felt like an empty cave, her head light as smoke. She brushed dirt from her skirt with shaking hands and looked at the man who'd stepped between her and violence. Their eyes met. In that moment, Zelda saw something she hadn't expected, not pity, which she'd endured from countless well-meaning people, but recognition. He saw her as she was not, as the world insisted she should be. She lifted her hands and signed the gesture's small and uncertain "thank you." Chaska's expression softened fractionally. He signed back his movements, precise, strong spirit. "You have courage." The words, if words they could be called, formed from motion rather than sound, hit Zelda like a warm wind. She'd been called many things in her 26 years, unfortunate, afflicted, simple-minded, broken. But courageous, never that. The drunk teamster, emboldened by Mullen's presence, and perhaps by the whiskey sloshing in his belly, drew his revolver halfway from its holster. Injuns got no call interfering with white folks' business. Chaska shifted his weight, angling his body further to shield Zelda. His palm opened in what might have looked like a calming gesture to the uninitiated, but Zelda saw the calculation in his eyes. He was measuring the distance between himself and the teamster, computing how quickly he could close that gap if the gun cleared leather. The teamster must have seen it too, because he hesitated, suddenly uncertain, and let the revolver slide back into its holster. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt and stalked away, muttering curses. A horse tied to the hitching rail, spooked by the tension crackling through the air, suddenly reared with a shrill whinny. Its hooves flailed wildly. Zelda, standing too close, stumbled backward. She would have fallen directly into the horse's path if Chaska hadn't lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her clear with enough force to swing her against him. For a breathless moment they were locked together, his arm across her shoulders, her weight pressed against his chest, their hearts hammering in a shared rhythm of adrenaline and relief. She felt the solidity of him, the warmth radiating through his buckskin shirt despite the cold mountain air. She smelled sage and wood smoke, and something else, something wild and clean, like wind across high plains. Their eyes met again, closer now, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition deeper than gratitude. A sense of kinship between two people the world had decided didn't quite fit. Then propriety and circumstance reasserted themselves, and he released her, stepping back with a hesitance that suggested he'd felt the same strange pull. Deputy Mullen leveled his shotgun toward the sky, finger resting near the trigger guard, not quite a threat, but close enough. "Enough excitement for one day," he announced. "Red Hawk, move along. Do your trading and be out of town by sundown. We don't need your kind stirring up trouble." His gaze shifted to Zelda, and something almost like discomfort flickered across his face. "Miss Remy, was it? You've got no business here now. Best find the boarding house and figure out your next step. Mrs. Kellen takes lodgers. 2 weeks' rent in advance." Zelda's hand brushed against Chaska's back as she steadied herself, her fingers lingering a fraction longer than necessary. She felt the muscles beneath the buckskin shift as he breathed. Both of them were acutely aware of the contact of the eyes watching them, of the invisible lines being drawn and redrawn in the dirt between acceptable and forbidden. She pulled away and bent to retrieve her roses, crushed now, most of the petals scattered in the road. Gideon Pratt descended the church steps and tossed a small leather coin purse at her feet. It landed with a dull clink. "Your travel advance," he said curtly. "Minus expenses for the trouble." Zelda stared at the purse and then at the church where Thomas Pratt had vanished, unwilling or unable to face her. She bent, picked up the purse, and walked past the crowd, with her head high, ignoring the whispers that followed her like wasps. Some were merely curious, others cruel, a few, very few, sympathetic. Chaska watched her go, his jaw tight, with an anger he kept carefully banked. Then he turned to Mullen and spoke quietly, but with an edge that made the deputy's eyes narrow. "The mountain gives warnings to those who know how to listen. You should pay attention before winter shows its teeth." Mullen snorted. "The only danger I see is you running your mouth. Get your pelts sold and get out before dark, Red Hawk. That's not a suggestion." But Chaska did not move immediately. He stood his ground for another long moment, letting Mullen feel the weight of his refusal to be cowed. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned and walked toward his tethered mare. His stride unhurried, his shoulders straight. The crowd, sensing the confrontation had passed without bloodshed, began to disperse, though many cast backward glances and continued their muttered conversations. The sun dipped lower, painting Frost Hollow in long shadows that made the false front buildings look like theater props, two-dimensional facades hiding nothing of substance behind them. The church bell swung again in the wind, its clapper striking the bronze shell in a rhythm Zelda Remy would never hear. But that rang out across the valley, like a warning no one heeded. And high above, on the jagged ridgeline that loomed over the town, like a crouched predator, fresh snow clung to steep slopes in patterns that Zelda's father, dead, now 10 years in a mine collapse, had taught her to read like printed words on a page. Unstable, dangerous, primed to fall at the slightest provocation. But no one was looking at the mountains. Not yet. Frost Hollow clung to the eastern face of the Rockies, the way a drowning man clings to driftwood desperately without grace, and with the constant understanding that survival was never guaranteed. The town had been born during a silver rush that fizzled within 2 seasons, leaving behind an abandoned stamp mill with machinery rusted into grotesque sculptures and a scattering of structures that pretended to permanence they didn't possess. A single narrow-gauge rail spur connected Frost Hollow to the wider world, but only during the warmer months. By November, snow would bury the tracks under drifts 15 feet deep, and the town would become an island in a frozen ocean, dependent entirely on the high mountain passes for supplies. Those passes were treacherous in the best conditions, steep switchbacks carved into unstable slopes, exposed to avalanches, rockfalls and storms that could kill a man in minutes. In winter, they became death traps, and whoever controlled them controlled the lifeblood of the town. The population hovered near 200 souls, most of them miners working played-out claims, ranchers running cattle on marginal grassland, or tradesmen serving both groups. There was a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a church, a one-room schoolhouse, and Dr. Miriam Pike's clinic, a converted storefront with whitewashed walls and the faint, permanent smell of carbolic acid. The air at this altitude was thin and cold, even in early autumn, and winters arrived with brutal speed, sealing passes and trails beneath avalanches that could swallow entire wagon trains. Supply routes were lifelines, and the men who controlled them wielded power far beyond what their numbers or official positions might suggest. Zelda Remy found lodging at a sagging two-story boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Kellen, a gray-haired woman with arthritic hands twisted like tree roots and a voice that cracked like a whip. She demanded 2 weeks' rent in advance, paid from the meager coin purse Gideon Pratt had thrown at Zelda's feet, and offered no sympathy, no welcome, nothing but a key to a narrow room on the second floor, and a warning that meals were served promptly at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and if you missed them, you went hungry. The room was barely wider than a coffin stood on end. A rope bed sagged in one corner, a cracked wash basin sat on a spindle-legged table, and a single window overlooked the mud-rutted main street. Zelda unpacked her trunk with movements made automatic by too many temporary rooms, in too many temporary places, 3 dresses, including the one she wore. A heavy wool coat, undergarments, stockings, a tortoiseshell comb that had belonged to her mother, and a leather-bound notebook she used for communication when sign language failed her. But the most precious items were in a small wooden box at the bottom of the trunk, her father's tools. A geologist's hammer with a worn hickory handle, a hand lens in a brass case, sketches on yellowed paper showing rock strata snow formations, the subtle patterns that spelled danger to those who knew how to read them. Her father, Samuel Remy, dead at 42 when a mine roof collapsed on him in the Colorado Territory, had been a surveyor and mineral assessor before drink and bad luck reduced him to day labor. But he'd taught Zelda everything he knew during the years they'd traveled together through mining camps and railroad towns, back when she was young enough that her deafness was seen as merely unusual rather than disqualifying. He'd taught her to read terrain, like a book, the hairline fractures in rock that presaged collapse, the warning signs of unstable snowpack, the subtle shifts in color and texture that indicated which slopes would hold and which would kill. Those lessons learned in the shadow of mountains, much like these, had been the closest thing to love he'd known how to give her. That first night in Frost Hollow, Zelda sat by the window and wrote in her notebook, not to communicate, but to process, to make sense of a world that had once again rejected her arrived. Rejected. No husband. Little money. What now? She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched the street below where lanterns flickered in saloon windows and men stumbled between buildings, their laughter silent to her but visible in the way their bodies moved. Frost Hollow felt like a trap closing slowly around her, its jaws lined with teeth of ice and stone. The next morning, she ventured out to seek work. The general store first Gideon Pratt refused to meet her eyes and waved her away before she could even present her notebook. "No positions," he muttered, busying himself with a ledger that looked suspiciously blank. The saloon next, a sprawling building with a false front, painted garish red, owned by a thick-necked man named Silas Coyle. When Zelda held up her notebook, explaining she could work cleaning tables, Coyle laughed outright, his belly shaking beneath a brocade vest. Can't hear customers calling for drinks, can't shout orders to the kitchen. What good are you? The seamstress, the blacksmith, the freight office all turned her away, with variations of the same refusal. By midday, Zelda's feet ached, and her stomach growled with a hunger that was becoming familiar. She'd eaten nothing since yesterday's stale biscuit, hoarding her remaining pennies. She found herself wandering to the edge of town, where the freight road wound upward into timber and granite, climbing toward the high pass that was Frost Hollow's only reliable connection to the outside world during winter. From this vantage point, she could see the ridgeline that loomed over the town, like a judge's bench, a jagged spine of gray rock and white snow. Beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful clean lines, lethal purpose. She studied it with her father's trained eye, noting the cornices of wind-packed snow overhanging the cliffs, the steep couloirs, where avalanches would naturally funnel the subtle color variations that indicated layering in the snowpack. The angle of the slope steeper than 40 degrees in places. The recent weather pattern, a warm spell followed by freezing nights, creating layers of instability, like a house built on shifting sand. These were conditions her father had warned against. When you see that he'd told her once, his breath reeking of whiskey but his eyes still sharp, you get off the mountain. You don't argue, you don't wait for permission, you just move. Because the mountain doesn't negotiate, Zelda. It just takes. She pulled out her notebook and sketched the ridgeline marking areas of concern with small X's and question marks, though she had no one to share the observations with. The act of drawing calmed her, gave her a sense of purpose, even if it led nowhere. A presence rather than a sound drew her attention. Chaska Redhawk stood a dozen yards away, his dun mare grazing on sparse yellow grass. He held a coil of rope in his hands, checking it methodically for frays or weak spots. When he saw her watching, he approached without hurry, his moccasined feet nearly silent on the rocky ground. He signed, "You see the mountain." She nodded and held up her notebook showing the sketch. He studied it thoughtfully, his dark eyes moving across the page. And Zelda found herself watching his face, the concentration there, the absence of the dismissiveness she'd grown so used to. He looked at her work the way one craftsman might examine another's, with professional assessment rather than judgment. He signed, "You red snow like my grandmother did. She was a winter scout. These slopes are dangerous." "Yes," Zelda signed back. "High avalanche risk. The cornice here," she pointed to her sketch, "will fracture. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. When it goes, everything below goes with it." Chaska nodded slowly. He gestured toward the town below, then toward the main freight road that cut directly beneath the worst of the cornices. "They do not listen. They think they control the mountain because they built a road. They do not care," Zelda signed a flicker of bitterness in the movement. "Or they do not believe someone like me can know things they do not." Chaska's expression shifted, something that might have been anger on behalf of her, or recognition of a prejudice he knew intimately. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object, holding it where she could see. It was a bone flute, perhaps 8 inches long, its surface yellowed with age and etched with simple pictographs. An eagle with outstretched wings, 3 pine trees in a cluster, a boulder split down the middle. He signed old trail markers. "My grandfather's grandfather negotiated with the first white settlers who came to this valley trading rights in exchange for showing them the safe routes through the passes." These marks, he traced the eagle, the pines, the split boulder. They correspond to landmarks on a trail that avoids the avalanche zones. "It is longer, but it does not kill people." Zelda's eyes widened. She pointed to the main freight road visible below, cutting its confident path directly beneath the unstable slopes. "Why does no one use the safe route?" Chaska's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the bronze skin. "Deputy Mullen controls the pass. He built a checkpoint on the main road and charges permit fees for every wagon that passes. The safe route would bypass his checkpoint." So he tells people the old trail is unmapped, dangerous, that only the main road is reliable. He forces all traffic onto the dangerous road to justify his fees and his position. Understanding crashed over Zelda like cold water. It was corruption of the simplest, most brutal kind, monopoly enforced at gunpoint, with human lives as the stakes. She signed, "People could die. People will die," Cheska signed grimly. "If the snow falls wrong, when not if." They stood in silence, the wind pulling at their clothing, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the deeper, mineral smell of stone. Zelda felt the weight of knowledge she couldn't share with a town that had rejected her information that might save lives, but that no one would accept from a deaf woman they'd already judged worthless. Chaska seemed to sense her frustration. He signed, "You are alone here." "Yes, I am alone here too. We understand each other, I think." It was a simple statement of fact without pity or false comfort, and Zelda appreciated that more than she could easily express. She met his gaze and nodded. For the first time since arriving in Frost Hollow, she did not feel invisible. He reached into his pack and withdrew a strip of dried venison, tough and dark, seasoned with salt and smoke. He offered it to her without ceremony or comment. Zelda hesitated, accepting charity always tasted bitter, but hunger won. She took the meat and nodded her thanks. It was chewy enough to make her jaw ache, but it was protein and calories, and she forced herself to eat, slowly, making it last. They stood together on the hillside as the sun arced westward, two outsiders on the fringe of a town that wanted neither of them, connected by nothing more than pragmatic recognition and a shared piece of dried meat. It was not friendship yet, not quite, but it was the seed from which friendship might grow if given time and circumstance. In the days that followed, Zelda scraped together survival in the margins of Frost Hollow's economy. She hauled laundry for Mrs. Kellen in exchange for reduced rent, backbreaking work that left her hands raw and her shoulders aching, but it kept a roof over her head. She learned the rhythms of the town and the morning freight wagons that climbed toward the pass, loaded with supplies bound for mining camps higher in the mountains. The afternoon return of miners from claims scattered across the hills, their faces gray with rock dust. The nightly gatherings at Silas Coyle's saloon where decisions were made and grudges settled over whiskey and cards. She also learned the key figures who shaped Frost Hollow's fate, the hidden architecture of power that governed who ate and who starved, who prospered and who failed. Dr. Miriam Pike was a rarity, a female physician in her mid-30s, university-educated in St. Louis, drawn west by a combination of idealism and a failed engagement she never discussed, but that occasionally showed in the tightness around her eyes. She ran a small clinic in a converted storefront, treating everything from broken bones to childbirths, earning respect grudgingly from a frontier that didn't quite know what to make of a woman who could set a fracture as skillfully as any man, and who wasn't afraid to tell miners twice her size that they were idiots for ignoring infected wounds. Zelda met Dr. Pike when Mrs. Kellen sent her to fetch medicine for a persistent cough. The clinic smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Dr. Pike looked up from grinding powders in a mortar and studied Zelda with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. She spoke slowly, enunciating clearly, so her lips could be read. "You're the mail-order bride Pratt rejected." It wasn't a question, but Zelda nodded anyway. Dr. Pike set down the mortar and switched to sign language fluid practice signs that spoke of genuine study rather than casual learning. "I worked with a deaf colleague in medical school." She signed and spoke simultaneously. "Brilliant surgeon. Taught me that deafness is not a deficit, merely a difference. Most people are too ignorant to understand the distinction." Zelda felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd carried for so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Thank you. That is not a common opinion." Dr. Pike shrugged. Common opinions are frequently stupid. I assume you're looking for work. I could use help organizing supplies, maintaining inventory, cleaning instruments. Pays modest, but honest. Interested. Zelda's throat tightened. She wrote rapidly, "Yes, very much yes. When do I start? Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock sharp. Don't be late." It was the first genuine opportunity Zelda had been offered since arriving, and she walked back to the boarding house with something dangerously close to hope kindling in her chest. Another unexpected ally emerged shortly after Ethan Lyle, a farmer in his early 30s who worked a struggling homestead on the valley floor below Frost Hollow. He came to the clinic 2 days into Zelda's employment, his right hand wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, his face drawn with exhaustion and pain. A plow blade had slipped and opened a gash across his palm deep enough to show bone. Dr. Pike stitched the wound with practiced efficiency, while Zelda held the lantern steady and handed over instruments without being asked. Forceps needle silk thread carbolic solution. Ethan watched her work through pain-squinted eyes, and when Dr. Pike finished and Zelda began cleaning blood from the exam table, he spoke up. "You're the woman Pratt rejected at the church." It wasn't quite a question. Dr. Pike's voice turned cold. "She is. And she's twice as capable as most men in this town, Ethan Lyle, so mind your manners." Ethan flushed. "I meant no offense, Doctor. Just heard the talk. Seemed cruel is all. More than just rejecting her the way they laughed, the way Mullen let it happen. Made me sick." He looked directly at Zelda. "You finding your feet here?" Zelda pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Trying. Not easy. But Dr. Pike gave me work. That helps." Ethan read it and nodded, his expression softening. "Town's hard on outsiders. Harder still on those it decides are weak. But I've seen you hauling water buckets that'd make strong men stagger. You're tougher than folks give credit." He paused, then added, "My wife Clara and we farm about 2 miles south. If you ever need anything, a meal, help, anything, you're welcome at our table." The offer was simple, genuine, and Zelda found herself offering a small smile, the first real one since arriving in Frost Hollow. Ethan tipped his hat and left, cradling his bandaged hand, but the encounter lingered in Zelda's mind as proof that not everyone in this hard town was blind or cruel. Amos Carver, the schoolteacher, was another quiet dissenter, a man in his 40s with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual squint from reading by lamplight. Amos ran the one-room schoolhouse and kept meticulous records of town affairs in leather-bound ledgers he stored in a locked cabinet. Zelda met him at the general store, where Gideon Pratt was overcharging her for flour, claiming short supply, despite shelves visibly stocked. Amos intervened, his voice mild but firm. "Gideon, the price yesterday was 20 cents lower. Are you adjusting for inflation by the hour now? Because if so, I should record that for the county assessor." Pratt scowled but relented, counting out the correct change with visible reluctance. Afterward, Amos walked with Zelda outside into the cool morning air. He signed clumsily, unpracticed, but with sincere effort, "Fair treatment for all. You deserve same as anyone." Zelda signed back, keeping her movement simple. "Thank you. Few here agree." Amos switched to writing in her notebook, his script neat and teacherly. "More agree than you think. But fear keeps mouths shut. Deputy Mullen and Silas Coyle run this town in ways that have nothing to do with law or elected office. Cross them, suffer consequences. I've documented it for years, but documentation without action is just paper." Zelda absorbed this. She wrote, "Why do people tolerate it? Fear, isolation. No federal law reaches this far into the mountains with any regularity. The last circuit judge was 2 years ago. Mullen is de facto law and Coyle controls most commerce. Together they form a stranglehold. And lately..." He hesitated, then wrote more. Lately, I've noticed a pattern. Freight shipments fail, avalanches block routes, prices spike, farmers fall behind on taxes, and Coyle buys their land contracts for pennies on the dollar. It feels orchestrated, but I can't prove it. A chill ran down Zelda's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She wrote, "I will keep my eyes open." Amos nodded. "Be careful. Mullen is dangerous when cornered, and Coyle is worse because he's smart." The warning was timely. Deputy Wade Mullen was indeed a fixture on the pass road, his checkpoint positioned at the narrowest part of the main trail where wagons couldn't turn around without risking a plunge down the mountainside. He charged permit fees that had no basis in territorial or federal law, but were enforced by the shotgun he carried, and the two deputies really just hired toughs who flanked him during business hours. Silas Coyle was the other half of the equation. His saloon was the largest building in Frost Hollow, with rooms upstairs for rent, a kitchen that served meals, and a gambling operation that ran nightly. He employed a crew of rough men drifters and ex-convicts drawn by wages and the absence of questions about their pasts. These men served as Coyle's enforcers, intimidating anyone who questioned prices or challenged his growing acquisition of land. Whispers circulated, quiet and fearful, that Coyle and Mullen were working together. That they wanted more than bribes and inflated prices. They wanted the entire valley, the fertile bottomland where men like Ethan Lyle struggled to farm. That a famine, carefully engineered, would drive land prices down and force desperate sales. But whispers were not proof, and proof was scarce. Chaska Redhawk remained on the periphery of town life, tolerated for his trade goods. Quality pelts fetched good prices, and his medicinal herbs were valued by Dr. Pike, but watched constantly. He camped outside town limits, his small fire visible from the edge of the settlement, his mare tethered nearby. He made no effort to ingratiate himself to the townspeople, nor did he avoid them. He simply existed in parallel, neither asking for acceptance nor particularly troubled by its absence. Zelda visited his camp one evening, after finishing work at the clinic, bringing a portion of stew Dr. Pike had shared, venison and potatoes, thick and warming. Chaska accepted it with a nod of thanks and gestured for her to sit on a flat stone near the fire. He was carving a piece of shed antler, shaping it into a toggle for rope or harness his hands, moving with the patient precision of someone who'd learned that rushing only ruined the work. Zelda watched the firelight play across his face, across the beadwork on his shirt, intricate patterns that must have taken someone weeks to complete. She wondered who had made it, his mother, a sister, someone else. She knew so little about him, about his life, beyond these brief intersections. He paused in his carving and signed, "You are learning the town, yes. Dangerous men here." Mullen and Coyle, he agreed. They block the safe trail. Force wagons onto the avalanche path. When snow falls heavy and supplies are lost, they profit from fear and scarcity. Classic strategy: create artificial shortage, inflate prices, force dependence. Why do people allow it? Fear. Isolation. No law this far out, except what Mullen invents. And people are good at convincing themselves that bad things happen naturally, not by design. Easier to believe the mountain is cruel than to believe your neighbors are. Zelda absorbed this. She signed, "Your flute markers, could they help? Could someone prove the safe route exists?" If someone brave enough to challenge Mullen openly, Chaska signed. "But who town rejected you? They tolerate me only for trade. We have no standing, no authority. Our word means nothing to them." Their eyes met across the fire, and Zelda saw in his face a reflection of her own frustration and the weight of knowledge without power, truth without audience. She signed, "Then we must make them listen." How she didn't have an answer yet. But the question hung between them, pregnant with possibility. As Zelda stood to leave, she stumbled slightly on uneven ground, her exhaustion catching up with her. Chaska's hand shot out, steadying her by the elbow. The contact lasted a moment longer than strictly necessary, long enough for both of them to register the warmth of skin through fabric, the closeness of the awareness that hovered just below the surface of their pragmatic alliance. They separated, but the awareness remained unspoken and complicated. He was Lakota in a white town, where native peoples were viewed with suspicion, at best hostility at worst. She was a deaf woman, already marked as defective, unsuitable, less than. Any affection between them, any connection beyond pragmatic cooperation, would be viewed as transgressive, scandalous evidence of moral failing on both sides. So they didn't speak of it. They simply stood in the firelight, two people learning the shape of an alliance that might, given time, become something more. But time in Frost Hollow was a luxury in short supply. The first heavy snow of the season arrived in the third week of October, falling overnight and dusting the ridgeline white like sugar on dark bread. Zelda woke to the vibration of heavy boots. On the boarding house stairs, Mrs. Kellen's lodgers rising early, stamping feet to restore circulation, cursing the cold. She dressed quickly in the dim pre-dawn light, pulling on her heaviest dress and wool coat, and went to the window. Below, the street buzzed with unusual activity for this hour. Wagons were being loaded at the freight office. Men shouted orders, their breath fogging in the frigid air. Horses stamped and snorted uneasy. Something was happening, something urgent. Zelda pulled on her boots and descended the stairs. Mrs. Kellen was in the kitchen frying cornmeal mush in a skillet black with age. She looked up as Zelda entered and spoke slowly enough for lip reading. Big supply train coming up from Denver. Last one before winter closes the pass for good. Whole town's depending on it. Flour, salt, pork, medicines, everything we'll need to survive till spring thaw. Zelda nodded understanding and accepted a plate of mush, eating quickly. Then she pulled on her coat and walked toward the edge of town, where the pass road began its steep ascent into the high country. The sky was a brittle crystalline blue, the kind of sky that comes after snowfall when the air is so cold it hurts to breathe. But on the ridgeline above, Zelda saw warning signs that made her stomach clench. Fresh snow clung to slopes steeper than 40 degrees, unstable, poorly bonded to the older snowpack beneath. Cornices overhung cliffs, their edges sharp and fragile. Wind carried powder and ghostly plumes, a sign that the surface snow was loose, ready to slide. Her father's voice echoed in memory. Warm days, followed by freezing nights. That's how you build a weak layer. Snow melts on the surface, trickles down, refreezes as ice. Then fresh snow falls on top, and you've got two layers that don't want to stick together. Add weight pack animals, men dynamite blast, and the whole thing cuts loose like a knife through butter. Zelda pulled out her notebook and sketched rapidly the ridgeline, the cornices, the couloirs, where avalanches would naturally funnel. She marked danger zones with heavy X's. Then she hurried toward the center of town, where a crowd was gathering near the church. The supply train hadn't arrived yet, but preparation was underway. Deputy Mullen stood at the center of the activity, collecting fees from the lead driver, a grizzled man named Horace Stubbs, who ran freight contracts throughout the Rockies. Silas Coyle lounged nearby, smoking a cigar, despite the early hour, his cold eyes watching the transaction with the satisfaction of a man collecting rent on property he didn't legally own. Zelda pushed through the crowd, her notebook already open. She'd written in large, urgent letters, "Avalanche danger ridgeline, cracking halt pack trains, until conditions improve." She tore out the page and pressed it against the church door where everyone could see, then grabbed Horace Stubbs' sleeve to draw his attention to it. He glanced at the note, frowning. "What's this now?" Deputy Mullen snatched the paper from the door, crumpled it without reading beyond the first line, and tossed it into the dirt. "Hysterical nonsense. The pass is clear. I wrote it myself yesterday, and I'll write it again today with the train." This woman doesn't know what she's talking about. Zelda shook her head vehemently. and pointed toward the ridgeline, gesturing emphatically, trying to convey through motion what she couldn't convey, through sound danger, fracture, collapse, death. Thomas Pratt, standing near his cousin Gideon, muttered loudly enough for others to hear. "Deaf girl thinks she knows better than the deputy. Ridiculous. Probably just trying to make herself important." Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd, not universal, but enough to sting. Mullen waved dismissively at Zelda. "Miss Remy, step aside. You're delaying important work." He ordered the mule train forward, a string of 16 animals loaded with supplies, worth a small fortune, representing the difference between a hungry winter and starvation for Frost Hollow. Zelda, desperate, now grabbed the lead rope of the nearest mule, planting her feet, trying physically to halt the train. A freight handler, a heavy-set man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, shoved her hard. She fell into the mud, pain flaring in her shoulder and hip. Her notebook skittered away, pages fluttering. She looked up to see boots and horse legs and the world tilting, her breath knocked out of her lungs. Then Chaska Redhawk was there, pulling her to her feet with one hand, while the other rested on his knife hilt, not threatening, but present a reminder. He steadied her, his grip firm on her elbow, and Zelda felt the world right itself. Their hands lingered in the contact, longer than strictly necessary, a brief anchor in chaos before he turned to face Mullen. "Listen to her warning." Chaska said, his voice level but carrying. "She reads terrain better than most surveyors I've known. The ridge is unstable." Mullen's face darkened. "You've got no say here, Redhawk. This is official territorial business." Chaska ignored him and addressed Horace Stubbs directly. "There is a safer route, longer but stable." He produced his bone flute, showing the etchings. "These markers correspond to landmarks on the old trail. It avoids the slopes most prone to avalanche. My people have used it for generations." Horace hesitated, glancing between Mullen's angry face and Chaska's calm one. Silas Coyle stepped forward, then his voice smooth as oil on water. "Stubbs, Redhawk's trying to redirect your train so he can ambush it on some back trail and steal your cargo. Don't trust an Indian over a sworn lawman. That's just common sense." The racism was blunt, effective, and it worked. Horace's expression hardened. "I'll stick with the main road, Redhawk. No offense, but I've got responsibilities." Zelda grabbed her notebook from the mud and sketched frantically a rough map showing the dangerous cornices, the angle of slopes, the alternate route Chaska described. She thrust it at Horace, her hands shaking with urgency. Horace looked at it, then at the ridgeline, doubt flickering across his weathered face. Maybe we should wait a day or two, let things settle. A distant rumble cut him off. Every head turned upward. On the ridgeline, a section of cornice broke free, a white slab the size of a small house sliding down the slope. It didn't reach the pass road, not yet. But it triggered smaller slides in the couloirs, cascading down with gathering speed, throwing up plumes of powder that rose like smoke. The sound, though Zelda couldn't hear it, must have been immense, because she felt it through her boots, through her bones, a subsonic vibration that made her teeth ache. The crowd fell silent, stunned. Zelda pointed at the ridge, and then at her sketch, her meaning unmistakable. "I warned you. I was right. Listen now before people die." Horace's face had gone pale. "Blast and damnation. That's not settling snow, that's active slides." Mullen's jaw clenched so hard, Zelda could see the muscles jumping. "It's settling from the overnight snowfall. Trail still safe." But another rumble closer this time, and another plume of white. These contradicted him more effectively than any words. A scout on horseback came galloping down from the pass, his mount's eyes rolling white with fear. He reined in hard and shouted. "Lead section of the train is trapped at the fork slide, came down behind them. Trail's blocked and the mules are spooked. Something fierce. We need help now." Panic rippled through the crowd, like wind through wheat. Mullen, his authority crumbling, looked around desperately, and his eyes landed on Chaska. He thrust his carbine forward. "You caused this with your talk stirring up superstition. Now fix it. Get up there and bring those mules down." It was absurd blaming Chaska for a natural disaster, but Mullen needed a scapegoat and Chaska was convenient. Before Chaska could respond, Zelda stepped forward. She tapped her chest emphatically and signed, "I go too." Mullen sneered. "On your own risk, girl. Don't expect rescue if you fall." Chaska met Zelda's eyes, a silent question passing between them. "Are you sure?" She nodded once, firm and certain. He signed, "Stay close. Follow my lead." "Trust me." "I do," she signed back. Within minutes, a rescue party assembled: Chaska, Zelda, Ethan, Lyle, carrying coils of rope, and two reluctant ranch hands, named Jeb and Harlan, who were motivated more by Mullen's threats than any sense of heroism. They set out at a fast walk that became a climb, ascending into the teeth of the wind, into cold so sharp it felt like breathing glass, into danger that was only beginning to reveal its true shape. The climb toward the trapped mules was brutal and beautiful, in equal measure, the kind of brutal beauty that the high Rockies specialized in, indifferent to human suffering. The trail switchbacked up the mountainside in steep zigzags, each turn revealing more treacherous terrain slopes, where snow lay in unstable drifts, rock outcrops glazed with ice drop-offs, where a single misstep meant a fall of hundreds of feet onto stone that would shatter bone like pottery. Wind scoured the exposed sections, carrying ice crystals that stung any bare skin like hornets. Zelda's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning in the thin air. She'd lived at altitude before, but not like this, not climbing hard at over 8,000 feet, not with exhaustion already weakening her legs. Behind her, Ethan Lyle cursed under his breath as the rope slung over his shoulders snagged on a scrub pine. The two ranch hands, Jeb, a lanky youth barely out of his teens, and Harlan, a stockier man with a face like a carved turnip, muttered complaints, but kept moving, driven by Mullen's threat of withheld wages. Chaska set the pace, moving with the steady efficiency of someone who'd spent his life in mountains. He didn't rush, but he didn't waste motion either, each step placed with careful intent. Every few minutes, he'd pause, checking the slope above, reading the snow the way Zelda read it, looking for cracks, listening in his case, for sounds of shifting feeling, for vibrations that presaged collapse. They reached a narrow ledge where the trail split. One path, the main freight road, cut directly beneath a massive cornice that overhung the cliff like a frozen wave about to break. The other path, barely visible and half buried in snow, angled east into a stand of wind-bent pines. Chaska pointed to the pines and signed to Zelda, "Safe route." Old markers there. She squinted and spotted it, a cairn of stacked stones, half buried but still visible, and beyond it, a blaze mark on a pine trunk, old but deliberately cut. Her heart lifted fractionally. The route existed just as he'd said. But the trapped mules were on the freight road, and reaching them meant crossing a slope of wind-loaded snow that could fracture at any moment. Chaska studied the terrain, his face unreadable, then knelt and drove an iron piton into a crack in the underlying rock. He threaded rope through the eye of the piton, testing the anchor with his full weight muscles straining against the resistance. Satisfied, he turned to the others. "We traverse one at a time," he said aloud, speaking for those who couldn't read sign. "Stay on rock where you can. Avoid the deep snow. If the slope starts to move, don't try to run uphill, you'll lose. Swim with it. Try to stay on top, aim for that outcrop." He pointed to a jumble of granite 30 yards across. Zelda went first at his gesture. She clipped the rope through a loop on her belt. Chaska had shown her how, and began the traverse, moving sideways across the slope. Her boots punched through the surface crust with each step, sinking 6 inches, sometimes a foot. She tested each placement before committing weight the way her father had taught her. The mountain will tell you where it's weak if you listen with your feet. Halfway across the cornice above groaned. Zelda couldn't hear it, but she saw a shower of ice crystals rain down glittering in the sunlight, and she froze instinctively. Chaska, belaying from the anchor point, gestured urgently, "Keep moving. Don't stop." She forced her legs to obey, crawling the last 10 feet to where exposed rock offered solid purchase. She collapsed against a boulder chest, heaving hands, shaking. Chaska followed, moving with the practiced ease of a mountain goat. And then came Ethan, then Jeb and Harlan, all of them white-faced and breathing hard. Below them, the situation was worse than reported. 4 mules stood on a narrow bench of trail, their packs askew, leads, tangled eyes rolling in panic. Behind them, the path was buried under a debris pile of snow and shattered pine trees, the remnants of the earlier slide. A freight handler, a young man named Carl with a bloody gash across his forehead, clung to the mule's harnesses, his face streaked with tears that had frozen on his cheeks. When he saw the rescue party, he shouted something Zelda couldn't hear, but she saw relief wash over his features. Chaska assessed quickly. The mules needed to be calmed, untangled, and led forward. But the trail ahead was blocked by a fallen tree, its trunk wedged across the path. Worse, fresh cracks spiderwebbed through the snowpack surrounding them. Evidence that the slope was under tremendous tension, a trigger pull away from catastrophic release. "Clear the tree first," Chaska said, gesturing to Ethan and Harlan. "Then we move the animals fast, all at once, no hesitation." Ethan and Harlan set to work with a saw and axe they'd brought, attacking the tree trunk. Chaska and Zelda descended to the mules, untangling leads with cold, stiffened fingers, speaking or signing calmly to the panicked animals. Zelda's father had kept a mule for hauling ore, and she remembered his techniques, moving slowly, avoiding sudden gestures, breathing steadily to transfer calm through proximity. One mule, a gray, with a wild eye, tried to bolt. Zelda grabbed its halter and pressed her forehead against its neck, closing her eyes, breathing slow and deep. She felt the animal's heart hammering against her face, felt its terror as a living thing. Gradually, incrementally, the heartbeat slowed. The mule stilled its breath, matching hers. When she opened her eyes, Chaska was watching her, something like respect or maybe wonder in his expression. He signed, "Where did you learn that?" "My father," she signed back. He said animals sense fear. If you master yours, you can calm theirs. Then a gunshot cracked across the valley, sharp, distinct, deliberate. The mules reared. Carl screamed. Zelda spun to see a rider on the ridge above one of Coyle's men, recognizable by the red bandana tied around his throat. He levered another round into his rifle and fired again, the shot kicking up snow near the mule's hooves, deliberately spooking them. "Boss says let the snow have 'em," the rider shouted, his voice carrying. "Teaches folks to use the proper road and pay proper fees. Sabotage. Murder if the mules were lost, because without these supplies, Frost Hollow would face starvation before spring." Rage flooded through Zelda, hot and clarifying. She looked at Chaska and saw the same cold anger in his eyes. The mules panicked, lunging toward the cliff edge. Chaska sprinted forward and tackled the lead rope of the nearest animal, his weight and strength barely enough to check its momentum. Zelda, without thought or hesitation, grabbed the rope of another mule and wrapped it around her waist, leaning back with everything she had. The mule pulled her across the snow, her boots skidding her shoulders, screaming. She dug her heels in, leaning back at an angle that made her spine feel like it might snap. Beside her, Chaska hauled on his rope muscles, straining his lips, moving in what might have been commands, or curses, or prayers. Their efforts synchronized without planning. For they leaned together, breaths matching in exertion, bodies angled as one unit against the combined weight of 1,000 pounds of panicked animal. Slowly, incrementally, the mules halted, trembling, but no longer bolting. The shooter, perhaps realizing he'd crossed a line, even Coyle wouldn't publicly defend, spurred his horse and vanished over the ridge. Silence returned, broken only by wind and the rasp of labored breathing. Ethan finished clearing the tree, the trunk rolling off the trail with a crash that sent up a spray of snow. "Move now," he barked, "before another slide comes." They led the mules forward, step by agonizing step, along the narrow trail. Chaska went first, testing each section of path. Zelda stayed at the rear, keeping the last mule calm with a hand on its neck, murmuring words she couldn't hear. But that seemed to soothe the animal through vibration and touch. Her hands, torn from rough rope, bled through her gloves. When they paused to rest on a wider section of trail, Chaska noticed. Without a word, he unwrapped the neckerchief from his throat, red cloth soft from wear, and tore it into strips. He took her hands in his, turning them palm up, and bound the makeshift bandages around her torn skin. His touch was careful, almost tender, his fingers lingering on her wrists as he tied the knots. Their faces were close in the cold mountain air. He murmured, she read his lips. "You see what others miss. You are brave in ways they do not understand. If you fall, I will pull you up. Always." Zelda felt something shift in her chest, something warm despite the cold. She took her pencil stub from her coat pocket and traced on his palm her letters, shaky but legible. "And if you fall, I will keep going for both of us." She paused after writing it, realizing the weight of what she'd just expressed, a commitment that went beyond pragmatic alliance. A promise that acknowledged they'd become something more than strangers, helping each other survive. Chaska's gaze held hers, dark eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper, and he nodded slowly before turning to lead the mules onward. They reached Frost Hollow as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. The mules were safe. The supplies enough to last the town perhaps 2 weeks were secured. But the pass road remained blocked, unstable and deadly. Deputy Mullen met them in the street, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "Took you long enough." He grunted, offering no thanks, no acknowledgement of the risk they'd taken. He turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff with wounded pride. Silas Coyle stood on his saloon porch, half hidden in shadow, watching. His expression was neutral, unreadable, but Zelda felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, calculating, cold, measuring her for a threat she didn't fully understand yet. Chaska caught her eye and signed. They wanted the mules lost, wanted supplies destroyed. Scarcity serves their purpose. Zelda nodded. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture of conspiracy rooted in greed and indifference to human life. But proof remained elusive, and the town, weary and frightened, wanted only to survive the coming winter. For now the first battle was won. But winter had barely begun, and the war that was coming would demand everything they had and more. The week following the mule rescue saw Frost Hollow descend into a grinding, anxious tension. The avalanche that had trapped the animals was officially deemed an unfortunate natural event. The kind of hazard anyone living in the mountains had to accept. But whispers spread through the town like frost creeping across glass whispers, that someone had been seen near the ridge before the slide, that the sound of explosions had echoed in the hills the night before, that this was no accident. No one spoke these suspicions loudly. No one pointed fingers at Mullen or Coyle in public spaces. Fear kept mouths shut and eyes downcast. Zelda threw herself into work at Dr. Pike's clinic with an intensity that left her exhausted each night. She organized supplies with obsessive precision, learned which herbs treated which ailments, assisted with patients handing instruments to Dr. Pike before being asked, anticipating needs through careful observation. She found satisfaction in the work and being useful in the rare moments when Dr. Pike would nod approval or write a brief, "Well done" in her notebook. One afternoon, while they were inventorying medicine bottles by the light of a kerosene lamp, Dr. Pike paused and wrote, "Mullen is increasing his permit fees. Wagons are detouring to longer routes to avoid him. Our supply situation will worsen quickly." Zelda wrote back intentional. Dr. Pike's expression was grim. She wrote, "I'm certain of it. Coyle's men have been approaching farmers. Ethan Lyle nearly lost his homestead last week. Suddenly there were back taxes he supposedly owed, and Mullen threatened seizure. Ethan scraped together money by selling his seed stock. He won't be able to plant properly in spring. The pattern was clear and brutal: create scarcity, drive up desperation, seize assets at rock-bottom prices. It was economic warfare, efficient and ruthless, enabled by isolation and the absence of oversight. Zelda wrote, "How do we stop them?" Dr. Pike shook her head, frustration evident in the sharp movements. She wrote, "Proof. We need undeniable physical proof that connects Coyle and Mullen to the sabotage, and someone brave or foolish enough to act on it." That evening, Zelda walked to Chaska's camp beyond the town limits. She'd fallen into the habit of these visits, bringing food when she had it, sharing silence, when words failed, finding in his presence a peace she'd rarely known. He'd extended his stay in Frost Hollow ostensibly to continue trading, but Zelda suspected his reasons were more complex, perhaps tied to the conspiracy they'd begun to uncover, perhaps tied to her. She found him repairing his saddle, replacing worn stitching with fresh sinew, thread, his hands moving with patient precision. He looked up as she approached, signing a greeting, and gestured for her to sit by his fire. The evening was cold, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Dr. Pike says Coyle is buying land through manufactured debt. Mullen enforces with threats. They need proof to stop it." Chaska read it and nodded slowly. He signed, "I have suspicions." Coyle's men were near the ridge before the avalanche. "I followed their tracks, found residue of black powder and fragments of fuse near a blast site." Zelda's pulse quickened. She wrote, "Can you show me tomorrow? Early, before town wakes." The next morning before dawn, they climbed into the high country together. The air was bitter cold, the stars still visible overhead, fading reluctantly as the eastern sky lightened. Chaska led her to a rocky outcrop above the pass road, where the slope had fractured during the avalanche. In a crevice sheltered from wind, protected from snowmelt, he showed her the evidence. Twisted lengths of fuse wire blackened at the ends. Black powder stains on the rock, dark against gray granite. And most damning, a blasting cap, brass and relatively new, still crimped to a short length of wire. Zelda examined it through her father's hand lens, her breath fogging the glass. The cap was stamped with a manufacturer's mark, Donovan & Sons, Denver, along with a batch number. She sketched the mark carefully in her notebook, her hand shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what they'd found. This was proof of deliberate sabotage, evidence that someone had placed explosives to trigger the avalanche. As she worked documenting the scene, danger arrived without warning, the sharp crack of a rifle shot, snow puffing up inches from her boot. Zelda couldn't hear the gunfire, but she saw the impact, felt the spray of ice crystals, and then Chaska was grabbing her arm and pulling her behind a boulder, his body covering hers protectively. Another shot ricocheted off rock, chips of granite flying. Chaska's weight pressed her into the ground, his heart hammering against her back, or was that her own heart? She couldn't tell, couldn't separate her terror from his in the chaos. His breath was hot against her neck, rapid and shallow, and she felt the tension in his muscles, coiled and ready. He risked a glance over the boulder. A rider, one of Coyle's men, recognizable even at distance by the black horse and the rifle with a brass-fitted stock, was positioned on a distant ridge reloading. Chaska signed rapidly, "Run when I signal. Head for the trees. Don't stop." He picked up a fist-sized rock and hurled it to the side, drawing the shooter's attention. Then he grabbed Zelda's hand and they ran, crouched low, scrambling across scree and snow. Bullets whined past. Zelda couldn't hear them, but she felt the air pressure, saw snow kick up in lines. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like they might give out. But Chaska's hand was solid in hers, pulling her forward, and she ran harder than she'd ever run. They reached the tree line and didn't stop until they were deep in timber surrounded by pines that blocked sight lines. Zelda leaned against a tree, her chest heaving, vision spotting at the edges. Chaska stood close, still holding her hand, neither of them pulling away immediately. When she finally looked up, his face was inches from hers, his eyes dark and intense. He signed. "They know we are searching. We have made ourselves targets. Worth it." She signed back, her jaw set. "For the truth, for justice." Justice, Chaska signed, and something bitter flickered across his face. Justice is rare for people like us, but truth we can pursue. They returned to town, separately cautious. That night, escalation came in a new form. Ethan Lyle was arrested on fabricated charges of trespassing on land Coyle claimed to have purchased. Mullen threw him into the makeshift jail, a reinforced cellar beneath the saloon, dark and damp, and secured with iron bars salvaged from the old stamp mill. Amos Carver, the schoolteacher, protested loudly in the street, his usually mild voice raised in anger. "This is tyranny. You have no legal authority to seize a man without trial." Mullen's response was swift and brutal, a rifle butt to Amos's jaw delivered with enough force to split his lip and send him sprawling in the mud. Blood streamed down his chin. The crowd that had gathered gasped, but didn't intervene, frozen by fear. Dr. Pike rushed to Amos's side, her face pale with fury. She helped him to the clinic and stitched the cut, while Zelda held instruments and Chaska stood guard by the door, his presence a silent warning that some lines wouldn't be crossed without consequence. Later in the privacy of the clinic, Dr. Pike confided in a low voice, "It's worse than land theft. Coyle is engineering a famine. Block the pass, lose supply trains, and the town starves or sells out. He'll own the entire valley by spring, and Mullen will ensure no one can challenge it through legal means." Chaska's jaw tightened. He signed to Zelda, who translated for Dr. Pike. "We have evidence of sabotage blasting Cap's powder residue. But how do we use it? Mullen controls enforcement. Coyle controls commerce. The nearest federal authority is 50 miles east, and winter is closing the routes." Dr. Pike's gaze was steely. "Then we force a public confrontation. Make them show their hand in front of witnesses who can't later be silenced or bought. Make the corruption so blatant that even fear can't keep people quiet." Zelda pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Demonstrate the safe route. Prove Mullen has been lying about dangers. Force the town to see the alternative exists." It was bold, perhaps reckless. But desperation bred boldness, and time was running out. They agreed to organize another caravan using Chaska's marked trail, bypassing Mullen's checkpoint, demonstrating once and for all that a safer route existed, and that the accidents on the main road were no accidents at all. If they succeeded, it would undermine Mullen's authority and expose Coyle's conspiracy. If they failed, they would likely be killed or imprisoned, and Frost Hollow would continue its slide into the grip of men who valued profit over human life. As they finalized plans, Zelda's hand brushed Chaska's on the table, an accidental contact that neither immediately withdrew from. Their fingers intertwined briefly, a moment of connection that spoke of trust deepening into something more complex, more dangerous. Dr. Pike, observing from across the room, said nothing, but her expression softened. The chemistry between Zelda and Chaska was undeniable, now impossible to ignore. Yet both remained careful, bound by social constraints that were real and dangerous. He, a native man in a white town, steeped in prejudice. She, a woman whose deafness already marked her as lesser in most eyes. Any affection between them, any relationship beyond pragmatic partnership would be viewed as scandalous proof of moral failing evidence that both deserved the scorn already heaped upon them. So they didn't speak of it. They simply held each other's hand a moment longer than necessary and let that suffice. The night before the planned caravan, Zelda sat by her window in the boarding house, unable to sleep. Snow fell silently past the glass-thick flakes that blurred the world. A soft knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Chaska, his face shadowed in the dim hallway. He held a small bundle dried venison and pemmican wrapped in cloth. He placed it in her hands without ceremony, signing, "For tomorrow. You will need strength." She signed, "If we fail, you should escape alone. They hate you less than they hate failure. If we fail," he signed, his movements slow and deliberate, "we fail together. I do not abandon partners. Not you?" Then hesitating, he added, "You see clearly what others refuse to see. Your vision may save this town. I trust that vision. I trust you." Zelda's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't easily name. She set the bundle aside and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of thanks, of connection, of something neither was quite ready to define. He didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, they stood in the doorway, the space between them charged with possibility and restraint in equal measure. Then he stepped back, nodded once, and disappeared into the dark hallway. Zelda closed the door and leaned against it, her heart beating hard enough that she felt it through her whole body. Tomorrow, they would challenge the power structure that had ruled Frost Hollow through fear and greed. Tomorrow, they would risk everything on the gamble that truth publicly demonstrated could overcome corruption. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Morning came cold and bright, the kind of high country morning where the sky is so blue it looks painted and the air is so clear you feel like you can see the curvature of the earth. Zelda dressed carefully, layering wool and leather for warmth and mobility, and met the others at the edge of town before most of Frost Hollow had stirred. The caravan was modest Chaska and Zelda Ethan Lyle, freed on a bribe and a promise that Dr. Pike had facilitated Amos with his swollen jaw, and 4 others willing to risk Mullen's wrath. They loaded a wagon with supplies and the evidence they'd gathered, blasting caps, sketches, Amos's ledgers documenting the pattern of accidents. The plan was straightforward: follow Chaska's marked route to the high pass, descend the far side to a trading post 15 miles east, and send riders from there to the nearest federal outpost with the evidence. Once federal authorities were involved, Coyle and Mullen's grip would be broken. Simple in theory, deadly in execution. They set off as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks, their breath fogging in the cold air. Chaska led on foot, his eyes scanning constantly, cross-referencing the bone flute's etchings with landmarks, the eagle-shaped rock, the cluster of 3 pines, the split boulder. Zelda walked beside him, her notebook in hand, sketching updates to the route as they progressed. Behind them, Ethan drove the wagon, his face set in grim determination. The others followed on foot or horseback, rifles slung over shoulders, everyone acutely aware of the risk. They reached the split in the trail by mid-morning. The main freight road, still partially buried by the earlier avalanche, veered left beneath the treacherous cornices. Chaska's route angled right into a narrow defile flanked by rock walls and twisted pines. The path was rougher, the snow deeper in places, but the slopes above were gentler, more stable. Chaska signed to Zelda, "This way. The mountain allows passage here." As they entered the defile, Zelda's sharp eyes caught something that made her pulse spike, a glint of metal half buried in snow near the base of a cliff. She knelt and brushed powder away, uncovering a length of fuse wire blackened at one end from burning. Her breath caught. She dug deeper, her fingers numb with cold, and found more, another blasting cap, rust-spotted but readable, and beneath it, a scattering of black powder grains mixed with snow. She called Chaska over with a gesture. He knelt beside her, examining the find, his expression darkening. More evidence of deliberate sabotage charges set to trigger slides, not on the main road where they'd already looked, but here on alternate routes to ensure no bypasses existed. He scraped more snow away, revealing boot prints preserved in ice beneath the powder, several sets relatively fresh, leading toward the ridge above the main freight road. The same ridge where the cornice had collapsed. Zelda's mind raced. She wrote rapidly in her notebook, "This proves sabotage. But we need something that ties it directly to Coyle and Mullen. Otherwise, it's just evidence of blasting. Could be miners, could be anyone." Chaska nodded and scanned the surrounding rock. His gaze fixed on something, and he moved to a crack in the granite, reaching in carefully. He withdrew another blasting cap, this one newer, less corroded, and held it up to the light. The stamp read, "Donovan & Sons, Denver." But beneath the manufacturer's mark was a secondary stamp, smaller, sold to S. Coyle Frost, Hollow, Colorado Territory. Zelda's breath stopped. Direct evidence. A paper trail stamped into brass. This wasn't just proof of sabotage, it was proof of who had purchased the explosives, who had set them, who stood to profit from the chaos. She copied the information into her notebook, with shaking hands, underlining it twice. Then Ethan's voice carried from the wagon. Riders coming from town, Zelda and Chaska, turned to see a group of horsemen descending the trail behind them, 6 men led by Deputy Mullen with his shotgun across his saddle. Behind him, Silas Coyle sat astride his black gelding, his face impassive as carved stone. And among them, Zelda's stomach dropped, was Amos Carver. But something was wrong. Amos rode slightly ahead of the others, his posture stiff, his expression tight. As the group drew closer, Zelda saw rope binding his wrists to the saddle horn. He wasn't riding with them, he was their prisoner. The caravan halted. Mullen reined in his horse a dozen yards away. "You're trespassing on a closed trail," he announced, his voice flat with authority. "Turn back immediately or face arrest for obstruction and conspiracy." Chaska stepped forward, his stance calm but unyielding. "This trail is open and safe. We are proving it can be used reliably. Your claims of danger are lies designed to maintain your illegal monopoly." Mullen's eyes narrowed. "Careful with your accusations, Red Hawk. Words like that can get a man killed in these mountains." Ethan from the wagon shouted back, "You have no legal authority to close a trail that was open for generations. We have rights to travel." Coyle spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and cold as ice over deep water. "Rights are a luxury afforded to those who can defend them. You're trespassing, you're undermining public safety, and you're doing it on your word against a deputy's authority. How do you think that ends for you?" Zelda, standing beside Chaska, pulled out the blasting cap she'd just found and held it high where Mullen and Coyle could see. She pointed to the stamp and then to the scattered powder, then to the ridge where the earlier avalanche had started. Her meaning was unmistakable. "You did this. We have proof." Mullen's face flushed dark red. Coyle's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened like a hawk sighting prey. "That's a serious accusation," Coyle said quietly. "Dynamite is common in mining country. Finding a blasting cap proves nothing." But then Amos spoke, his voice hoarse and urgent. "They're not here to arrest you. They're here to silence you. I overheard them planning last night. They mean to trigger another slide, bury you, and the evidence call it a tragic accident. You have to run now." Mullen backhanded Amos across the face, the blow snapping his head sideways. "Shut your mouth, Carver, or you'll join them under the snow." Chaska's hand went to his knife hilt. The other caravan members raised rifles. Tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Then from higher on the ridge, a shout. "Charges set, boss, on your signal." Zelda's blood turned to ice. She spun to see two more of Coyle's men positioned on the slope above, near where she and Chaska had found the first cache of explosives. They held what looked like blasting equipment plunger detonators, the kind used to trigger charges from a distance. Coyle smiled, thin and cold. "Last chance. Drop your weapons, surrender the evidence, and I'll let most of you walk away. Refuse, and the mountain makes the decision for all of us." Ethan's voice was tight with controlled fury. "You're insane. You'll kill yourself and your own men." "We're positioned safely," Coyle said. "You're not. Simple geometry." Zelda's mind raced through options, discarding each as quickly as it formed. They were trapped, caught between armed men below and explosives above, with no cover adequate to survive a deliberate avalanche triggered directly overhead. Then Chaska signed to her, his movements small and hidden from the others. "Trust me. When I move, run for the pine grove there." He indicated a dense stand of trees 30 yards to their left, on higher ground, partially sheltered by a rock outcrop. She signed back, "What will you do? What I must. Go when I signal. Do not wait for me." Before she could protest, Chaska stepped forward, his hands raised peacefully, and spoke in a voice loud enough to carry. "Coyle, you want someone to blame, someone the town will believe deserves punishment. Take me. Let the others go with the evidence. Tell the town the Indian was sabotaging trails to steal freight. They'll believe you. They always believe men like you over men like me." Zelda's heart clenched. He was offering himself as a scapegoat, sacrificing his freedom, maybe his life, to save the rest of them. Coyle considered this, his head tilted like a predator evaluating wounded prey. An interesting offer. But I think... He never finished. From the ridge above, one of the men shouted in alarm. "Something's wrong with the charges. They're smoking on their own." A massive explosion ripped through the morning air. Not the controlled detonation Coyle had planned, but something far larger, far more chaotic. The blast shattered the cornice above in a dozen places, simultaneously sending house-sized blocks of ice and snow cascading down the slope. The avalanche began. Everything happened in fragmented, nightmarish instants. Coyle's horse reared, throwing him. Mullen fired his shotgun reflexively, the blast going wide. Amos, still bound to his saddle, fought to control his panicked mount. Chaska grabbed Zelda's arm and pulled her toward the pine grove, both of them sprinting as the white wall of death roared down behind them. The sound, Zelda couldn't hear it, but she felt it through every atom of her being, a roar that made the earth shake and the air vibrate until her bones ached. She ran, boots slipping on ice lungs, screaming for oxygen in the thin air, Chaska's hand locked on her wrist like iron. They reached the pines as the avalanche hit the main trail. The wall of snow swept over the spot where they'd been standing seconds before, swallowing horses and men and wagons in an indifferent white flood. The force of the wind blast ahead of the slide knocked Zelda off her feet. She fell hard, her shoulders slamming into a tree trunk, pain exploding through her arm. Chaska threw himself over her, his body a shield as debris rained down branches, rocks, chunks of ice the size of skulls. Something struck his back with a sickening thud, and he grunted in pain, but didn't move, didn't expose her to the chaos. The avalanche roared past the main mass, missing their shelter by yards, but close enough that powder snow filled the air until she couldn't see, couldn't breathe. She coughed, choking on ice crystals, her face pressed against Chaska's chest. She felt his heartbeat fast, fierce, alive. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The roar faded to echoes. The air cleared slowly, revealing devastation. The trail where they'd stood was gone, buried under 15 feet of compacted snow and debris. The wagon was overturned, and partially visible, one wheel jutting from the white like a skeletal hand. Bodies were scattered, some moving, some terribly still. Chaska pushed himself up carefully, wincing. Blood stained the back of his buckskin shirt where something had struck him. Zelda grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with concern. But he shook his head and signed, "Not serious." Others need help. They scrambled down from their shelter into the disaster zone. Ethan was pulling himself from a snowbank, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but conscious, mobile. Two of the other caravan members were digging frantically, trying to uncover someone buried in the flow. And Amos, still tied to his saddle, his horse half buried, was thrashing weakly, his face blue, suffocating. Zelda reached him first, pulling her knife from her belt and sawing through the ropes binding his wrists. Together, she and Chaska hauled him from the saddle and dragged him clear. Amos coughed, vomiting snow and bile, but he was breathing. Mullen lay 20 feet away, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, trapped under a boulder. His shotgun was gone, buried somewhere. He saw Zelda and Chaska approaching, and his face twisted, fear, shame, resignation, all mingled. "Do it," he croaked. "Finish me. I deserve it." Zelda looked at Chaska. For a long moment, they stood over the man who'd tormented them, who'd enabled corruption and cruelty, who'd nearly gotten them all killed. It would be easy to walk away, to let the mountain finish what it had started. Chaska signed, "What do you choose?" Zelda pulled out her notebook and wrote, showing it to Mullen, "We are better than you. We prove it by saving you." Then she and Chaska worked together to lever the boulder off Mullen's leg. He screamed in pain, then passed out. They splinted the limb with broken branches and strips of cloth torn from their own coats. Silas Coyle was found 50 yards downslope, buried up to his chest, his face gray with shock and pain. His leg was crushed bone, visible through torn flesh. One of the caravan members wanted to leave him, but Dr. Pike, who'd come running from town at the sound of the explosion, overruled him. "We're not murderers. We're civilized people, and we'll act like it, even if he wouldn't." They dug Coyle out and stabilized him as best they could with the supplies at hand. The two men who'd been setting the charges were dead, caught in the blast they'd triggered prematurely. Whether it had been accident or sabotage by someone else, no one knew. And it didn't matter now. As the survivors gathered in the aftermath, stunned and battered, Amos produced something from inside his coat, a leather-bound journal, miraculously intact. "Coyle's records," he gasped. "I stole it last night before they caught me. Every bribe, every land theft, every shipment he sabotaged, it's all documented in his own hand. He kept it as insurance against Mullen turning on him. Now it's evidence against both of them." Chaska and Zelda exchanged a glance, relief, exhaustion, grim satisfaction. They had proof. Undeniable, documented, signed in the conspirators' own hands. The town came up the trail in force, drawn by the explosion, by the plume of snow, visible for miles. They arrived to find Mullen and Coyle incapacitated, evidence spread before them, and Zelda and Chaska standing together, battered but unbroken. Dr. Pike spoke to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying. "These two, this deaf woman you mocked, and this Lakota man you despised, they risked everything to expose the corruption that was destroying us. While Mullen and Coyle conspired to starve us into submission, and these two fought for the truth. Who deserves your respect? Who has earned your trust? Silence." Then Ethan Lyle stepped forward, his bandaged head held high. "They saved me. Saved my farm. Saved this whole damn town. I stand with them." "And I," said a miner Zelda had treated at the clinic. "And I," said a ranch wife whose child Dr. Pike had delivered. One by one, voices joined, not all, not even most, but enough. Enough to shift the balance. The federal marshal, when he arrived 3 weeks later after the passes partially cleared, found a town ready to testify. Coyle and Mullen were taken into custody, tried in Denver, and convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy fraud and attempted murder. Mullen received 10 years in territorial prison. Coyle, whose injuries left him crippled, received 15. The land seized through fraud was returned to its rightful owners. Ethan Lyle got his farm back, his seed stock repurchased with money recovered from Coyle's accounts. The safe trail that Chaska had marked was surveyed, widened, and officially designated the primary pass road. Mullen's checkpoint was demolished. And Frost Hollow, for the first time in years, breathed freely. Spring came to the Rockies the way it always did, reluctantly, grudgingly melting the snowpack inch by stubborn inch. By late March, the passes began to clear enough for riders to travel. The town sent delegations east with testimonies and evidence ensuring that justice would be thorough and final. Zelda and Chaska had become fixtures in Frost Hollow's recovery. The town council formally offered Chaska a position as official pass guide and surveyor, with salary and a small cabin on the edge of town. They offered Zelda a position as deputy surveyor and safety assessor, working with the territorial government to maintain safe routes through the mountains. Both positions came with something more valuable than money: respect, recognition, a place. One evening in early April, as wildflowers began to push through the last patches of snow, Zelda and Chaska walked the ridgeline, where they'd first found evidence of Coyle's sabotage. The view stretched for miles the valley below, greening with new growth, the peaks still white, but softening in the warmer light. Chaska signed, "The town has changed. You changed it." "We changed it," Zelda corrected. Together. He nodded and then signed something else. His movement slow and deliberate. I was alone for a long time. Moving from place to place, never belonging. But here with you, I feel like I have found something I did not know I was searching for. Zelda's eyes shone. She signed. I was told my whole life that I was broken, that my silence made me less. You were the first person who saw past that, who saw me. Because you are not broken, Chaska signed fiercely. You are whole, perfect as you are. Anyone who cannot see that is blind, and their blindness is not your burden to carry. They stood close, the space between them, charged with an emotion they'd kept carefully banked for months. Now, with danger past and futures opening before them, the barriers felt less insurmountable. Chaska reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he cupped her face gently in his palm, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. Zelda leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly, savoring the warmth of the connection, the feeling of being truly seen. They didn't kiss, not then, not on that windswept ridge where propriety and caution still held some sway. But they stood forehead to forehead, breathing in sync, their hands clasped between them, and spoke without words of commitment and hope, and a future they would build together, one careful step at a time. In the town below, preparations were underway for the spring planting. Fields that Coyle had tried to seize were being sown with wheat and barley. The stamp mill, long abandoned, was being dismantled for salvage, its rust-eaten machinery finally laid to rest. Dr. Pike had taken on an apprentice, a young woman from Denver, who'd heard of Frost Hollow's female doctor and wanted to learn. Together, they were expanding the clinic, building an addition that would serve as a small surgery. Amos Carver, his jaw healed and his spirits restored, was teaching a new generation of students not just reading and arithmetic, but also sign language and the history of the indigenous peoples whose land they now occupied, teaching with the understanding that knowledge and respect were not opposing forces, but complementary ones. And Ethan and Clara Lyle hosted a gathering at their farmhouse in late April, a celebration of survival, of justice of spring. They invited everyone who'd stood against Coyle's tyranny and some who hadn't but were trying to make amends. Zelda arrived wearing a new dress, simple calico but clean and well-fitted, sewn by the town's seamstress, who'd finally agreed to take her money without contempt. Chaska wore his finest buckskins, the beadwork brilliant in the afternoon sun. They walked together openly now, their partnership acknowledged and if not universally celebrated, at least accepted. At the gathering, as people ate and talked and children played in the greening fields, Ethan stood and raised a glass. To the people who saved us when we were too blind and too scared to save ourselves. To Zelda Remy, who sees more with her eyes than most of us see with all our senses. And to Chaska Redhawk, who proved that honor has no boundary of blood or birth. Thank you. Glasses raised. Voices echoed the sentiment. Zelda felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and gratitude. She'd come to Frost Hollow expecting nothing, hoping only to survive. Instead, she'd found purpose, partnership, and something that felt dangerously close to home. Chaska, standing beside her, signed where only she could see. "You are everything I did not know I needed. If you will have me, I will stand beside you for as long as the mountains stand." Zelda signed back her movements, certain and clear, "I will. Always." Later, as summer deepened and the high country bloomed with alpine flowers, they were married in a quiet ceremony conducted by a circuit preacher who'd heard their story and agreed to officiate despite the raised eyebrows of more conservative congregants. Dr. Pike stood as witness. Ethan and Clara attended along with Amos and a growing number of townspeople who'd come to see past prejudice to the truth beneath. The ceremony was simple, conducted in both spoken English and sign language, honoring both their languages. When the preacher pronounced them married, Chaska took Zelda's hand and signed against her palm, "My partner, my home." And Zelda, deaf to the church bell that rang above them, but feeling its vibration through the floorboards, signed back, "My strength, my heart." They built a life in Frost Hollow, not without challenges, not without occasional prejudice from those who couldn't see past surface differences, but with a foundation of respect earned through fire and ice. They worked the pass routes together, Zelda mapping safe corridors and Chaska guiding caravans. They became known throughout the territory as the team that could navigate anything the mountains threw at them. In winter, when storms sealed the passes and the town became an island, they would sit by their fire, and Chaska would carve bone or wood, while Zelda sketched maps and diagrams. They would sign to each other in the firelight, speaking of dreams and plans and small everyday joys that neither had known before they found each other. And sometimes on clear nights, when the stars seemed close enough to touch and the mountains loomed dark against the sky, Zelda would stand at their cabin door and look out at the ridgeline that had almost killed them both. She would remember kneeling in the dirt outside the church, crushed roses in her hands, the world telling her she was worthless. She would remember the man who'd stepped between her and cruelty, who'd seen her strength when no one else would. And she would feel Chaska's presence behind her, his warmth at her back, and know with a certainty that required no hearing, no sound, that she had found something more valuable than gold, more enduring than stone. She had found her voice silent though it was. She had found her home hard-won and precious. She had found her partner steadfast and true. And in finding them, she had found herself. The mountains stood eternal, indifferent to human joy and sorrow. But in their shadow, two people who the world had tried to diminish had built something the mountains could not touch. A bond forged in survival, tempered by courage and polished by love, into something that would endure as long as memory lasted. The church bell rang on in Frost Hollow, silent to one, but heard by all its song, a promise that courage, though costly, was never wasted. That truth, though slow to arrive, would come. That two people dismissed and diminished by a world that judged surfaces rather than souls could stand together and move mountains. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.